Welcome to Exploring the Intersection of Story and Music. This panel brings together some incredible composers, music makers, storytellers, and developers to discuss the intersection of music and narrative in games. From driving immersion to establishing a vibe and theme to being the storytelling medium itself, music is a powerful way that games deliver emotional intensity alongside the narrative. I'm so excited to be able to chat with all of you today for LudoNarraCon. I know we'll have plenty to discuss, so rather than extend this preamble, let's just get into it. To start, I'd love to let each of our esteemed panelists introduce themselves. Do feel free to take a few minutes each to talk about your relationships to music and narrative.
All right, I guess I'll go first. Hi everyone, I'm Devin Vibert. I'm the audio director at Silver String Media. My relationship to the topic, the topic at hand here. I want to say it began when I was 8 or 9 and finishing my first playthrough of Super Mario RPG for the Super Nintendo. When you finish the game, there's like this long credit sequence with a parade of all the characters you meet in the game. And near the end of the parade, it gets like super wistful. And you kind of realize your adventure's over, and Mario and Bowser are no longer going to be on a team together. And my 8 or 9-year-old self was like, uh-oh, I'm about to start crying at this game. And I don't think my parents will understand this. And so it was like this realization that like I needed this music in my life because like every time I heard it, it called to mind all of the emotions that I'd felt while playing through the game. I literally pirated this music, but since it was like the 19 whatevers, I had to actually like take the TV output and put it into my dad's cassette thing and then steal the music on a cassette so I could listen to it in the car later. It's like pre-internet pirating. But anyway, it was like this really poignant moment for my own childhood, I guess, where I was like, oh, like, music and video games, apparently they can do some stuff together. But more from like a how did I come to this field, I guess. Lucas Johnson, the cohort with Claris at Silver String. We've been friends since like grade 4, and it just was kind of a natural progression that as he started writing for fiction and games at Silver String, I was around and able to write music. So we just were working together on cool things, and then at some point we also were able to make some semblance of a living from it, and it just kind of went from there. In my recent past, I've been doing a lot of like prototyping work with Silver String. This year we'll be starting full production on a super chill game that I'm super excited about, but I'm not sure how much I can actually say about it at this point. All right, yeah.
Cool.
So stay tuned. Cool things are happening. I think that's a good introduction. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Devin. And how about you, John?
Hi, so I'm John Ingold. I'm the narrative director at Inkle. We're an indie studio in the UK. We're kind of venerable these days because we've been going about 12 years, which is a long time for an indie studio. So we're best known for 80 Days or Heaven's Vault or recently Overboard or A Highland Song, depending on when you noticed that we existed. And we're tiny. We're really tiny. At the moment, there's just 3 of us in the company full time, actually. And so my job is I'm primarily the writer and the narrative director. So I work out what the stories are and how they fit together and how the gameplay works within the narrative, the usual kind of narrative director stuff. But because we're so small, we don't have an audio person. So we do that as well. So between me and Joe Humphrey, my co-founder, we kind of split the audio duties depending on what they are. So if he's the programmer amongst many other hats that he wears. But so anything which is procedural or kind of built into the code, he tends to handle, and anything which is built into the script and triggered by the story and the events of what's going on in the plot, that tends to fall onto me. the actual music that we use is almost entirely composed by one guy called Lawrence Chapman, who we've worked with for the last 10 years, who is just a phenomenal composer of classical music. And so we first found him completely by chance when he wrote the theme for 80 Days in about 4 hours. He just said, "Oh, I've got an idea." He cold emailed us, and it was fantastic. We worked on him with him on absolutely everything we've done, pretty much. Apart from Overboard, which is kind of an interesting one from a music point of view, because it's entirely built using found music and old recordings and like old vinyls from the 30s. And there's a couple of wax cylinder recordings in there as well. I think there's one that was made by Thomas Edison himself. So that was really fun, just kind of taking a completely different approach on scoring a game. But yeah, in terms of actually writing music, that is not a thing that I do. Like, I'm entirely a connoisseur and a user of music. And yeah, that's how I fit into the discussion.
Excellent. Luna.
Yeah, I'm Lena Rain, and I'm a composer for all sorts of games, albums. I've done some work on short film and some TV stuff, but primarily games. I guess just kind of reflecting on what Devin was mentioning of kind of the initial cue to go into game music. It was a sort of a similar situation where I was playing one of my first RPGs. I was playing Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo, and that game, was sort of my understanding of how powerful music could be in games. I'd played games basically since I was 6 years old, and I was playing like Mario and Zelda and all that stuff. And it was great, like accompaniment, to the soundtrack or to the gameplay of it. But I didn't really like put that missing piece into place until I played Chrono Trigger and really just like felt so much emotion for these characters, and like was just so like tragic. It was tragic when I beat the game, and I was just like, I have to play it more. And so luckily there's multiple endings, so I just kept going through. Got all the endings. And from there, it was kind of like, how do I do this? How do I make music that can evoke these kinds of emotions in people, specifically in the context of a game, playing something, playing an RPG over and over for hours. And like the industry path that got me there was sort of winding and convoluted, as it is for everyone, but kind of went through studying music and then going through QA into game design. And then I worked as a game designer for 7 years, and then eventually got to work as a composer on the game that I was working on, Guild Wars 2. And then from there, my independent music brought me to the awareness of the Celeste team, and that was my first sort of big breakout hit game wise. And it's kind of been picking up jobs here and there as the years go by since then, and just continued to find new projects that give me the opportunities to express new and interesting things in game audio, game music, and game design as well. So yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. All right, Liam, will you close out our introductions?
Absolutely. My name's Liam Esler. I'm the managing director of Summerfall Studios, based here in Melbourne. Before I got into games, I wanted to be an actor, and so I did a lot of study in musical theatre as a extremely gay theatre nerd. And so, when David and Ellie and I started Summerfall, and we were like, what's our first game going to be? We were like, well, we know it needs to be like narrative driven because we want to build out our narrative tooling. We're like, what if we did a musical? What if we did like an interactive musical? And through that, I ended up, like, a lot of my background is in production and narrative, and I ended up being one of the lyricists on the game, which was a lot of fun, and got to pull out the horrifying poetry skills of like 14-year-old me which was probably the last time that I'd had to write anything like that. And it was a lot of fun. Like Stray Gods was such a unique project, and really affirmed like the premise that we went in with, which was that we thought that we could make players fall in love with characters a lot faster through song than we could through dialogue. And player responses definitely proved that out, which has been really nice. But yeah, like we got to work with Austin Wintory on that game, and he's incredible. And team of lyricists, including Melbourne's Tripod and Sydney's Montaigne, who is Australia's entrant to Eurovision in like 2020 and 2021. It was an incredible experience. It was very cool.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I am your humble host and moderator, Claris Cyarron. I work with Devin, as you mentioned, at Silver String Media. I serve there as creative director, and I also, as you probably can see in the background, I like music. I'm a hobbyist. I don't consider myself a professional musician by any stretch of the imagination, but I've had the joy of working and collaborating a bit with Devin throughout the years, and especially on the soundtrack to our most recent large release as a studio, Glitchhikers: The Spaces Between. So yeah, I'm just thrilled to be here with y'all and to be able to nerd out about like two of my favorite subjects, storytelling and music, and how they're kind of the same thing when you come at it from a lot of different angles. And so yeah, I guess I would love to, going around in the same order, hear a little bit from each of you about how you approach using music to set the tone of the narrative. And like, this is with the understanding that not everyone here is the composer, but that, you know, it's something that you think about as part of, you know, working as a team, and also how you leverage the musicians that you are going to work with, as well as how that connects to exploring the narrative and fleshing that out during development. So, yeah, Devin, would you like to start us off with that?
Sure, yeah. I think this is probably the boring answer, but I think really like some of the basic, like the fundamentals of the game, like the genre of the game, are gonna inform a lot of my like initial ideas about how exactly music is gonna fit in the game in general, and like yeah, because it's just there's so many different kind of creative constraints that emerge depending on what the genre is, because every genre of video game has its own kind of baggage and its own set of expectations about like how it's supposed to be. Like maybe like for example, like if the game is a like horror, like a first person horror game, you know, it's probably, and again, I'm making broad assumptions here, but it's probably going to require a different type, probably a type of music in general, probably something that doesn't have a ton of melodies playing all over the place, taking up lots of space in the audio sphere. Whereas, like, if it's a 2D, like, casual puzzle game, you can probably get away with having, like, a very melodic, very present kind of music that is on like a 2-minute loop or something, and you know there's gonna be dynamism, like oh no, maybe there's tension because the timer's running out and this level is almost over, but like it just behaves, the structure of the game kind of, it forces you to make certain compromises in how you write the stuff. Yeah, the other thing I'd say is like it also depends on like where or when in the development process like I get to have an opinion. Like if I'm brought on later in the process, then you know a lot of game mechanics might be fully fleshed out, and so you know we just can't do it that way because XYZ, and so I have to be able to you know accommodate that, because like the music is of course important, but it's like not the only thing. And conversely, like if I happen to have the luxury of being involved early in the process, it you know it lets me kind of sneak my opinion in here and there and be like, oh, you know, it would be really cool if we could do something like this, if it's possible, you know, just to put that little grain of whatever into other people's heads. So like, yeah, in an ideal world, I'd be involved from the get-go, but the reality is that a lot of projects, depending on various circumstances, you don't have the luxury of like just doing it exactly how you would like it, and that can be a good thing. Like, it forces you to do things that you wouldn't normally do and step outside your comfort zone as a composer or a creator, and do things you never would have done otherwise, I guess.
Excellent answer. How about you, John?
So we don't really have an established way of doing it. Like, we quite often try different approaches to getting the music in with every game, or we kind of look at what we did last time and think, okay, how can we adapt that? And when we started out, we didn't use very much music at all. We had this kind of idea of there would be a theme and like an outro theme, and then everything else was just ambient sound effects. And we kind of thought, it's sort of the minimum viable amount of music. And when it wasn't until we built Heaven's Vault that we thought, okay, now we're feeling more confident, we're feeling bolder, let's go out there and we'll put together a soundtrack, because it would be nice to have a soundtrack that goes with this game. And I remember the interesting thing for me about that was trying to work out the sound that we wanted in the first place. So we did do this in collaboration with the composer, and sort of we'd suggest things and he'd kind of knock up very quick themes, and we'd listen to them and go, okay, what do we think about that? And there were so many different directions we could go. But it's a game about archaeology, and it's a game about space. So, we thought about electronic music for the space theme, and we thought about there's an instrument called a duduk, which is a sort of, I don't really know how to describe it. It's a kind of Middle Eastern pipe, I think. But it has a particular sound that our composer said, oh yeah, if you watch any film that has anything set in a desert or any desert-like city, it will use this instrument. And he wrote us a very nice piece of music on this instrument. And we were like, no, wow, that sounds really cheesy. And actually, whenever you watch any TV or any film with any sand in it, pretty much, there's a duduk in the background. I can't take it seriously now, because it's just like a composer going, I don't know, I'm going to play a duduk, it's going to be fine. And we went round this cycle for quite a while, actually, really struggling to find an identity. And then eventually, Lawrence, who, we'd sent him artwork and plot synopses and just sort of vibe information, he did what he always does, ultimately, which is just write back and say, oh, I had this idea, and I think it's the right idea. And it was the cello opening that comes at the start of the game, which is this just a solo, strong cello melody. And there's nothing Middle Eastern or North African or desert punk about it at all. It would be suitable, in a Renaissance German context. It would sound fine. But it's gorgeous, and it's epic, and it's spacious. And Joe and I both just listened to it and just went, well, it's that one. Obviously, it's that one. And it was just glorious, actually. And I think there was a trend in that we've kind of stuck with, that quite often we find that the music is like its separate axis from the story. We're increasingly not trying to find music that fits even slightly diegetically into the world that we're building. Like, we'll make a game about robots and the soundtrack will have a harp, and there's no requirement for the musical style to fit the style of the world. In fact, we find that if it doesn't, you create more of an evocative space in some way that I don't really understand, but I quite enjoy playing with. So, eventually Lawrence took this theme and then built a whole album around it and sent it back, and then I had just the fun of just finding bits of story that I could slot these pieces into and create different effects from the contrast, essentially, between what was happening visually, what was happening narratively, what was happening musically, and sort of pulling those things apart to create wider spaces. And that, I think I learned a huge amount from that, and just got a lot more respect, actually, for, not that I ever disrespected composers, but a lot more respect for the job of people who score movies and plays and games in general, because I think I hadn't really realized how incredibly creative you can be. Like, we all notice the standout moments. We notice when John Woo plays Somewhere Over the Rainbow during a gunfight in Face Off, because it's a standout moment. But actually, of course, people scoring films are doing this all the time, and games too. They're kind of putting things together that don't work in a way that really works. And yeah, so that's been really enjoyable, actually, since Heaven's Vault, and in kind of all of our future projects, trying to find those those associations that work in a different way. And then we made this game called The Highland Song, which is all about Scottish music, and for that we completely went the other way and did something that was totally based on the landscape and the environment, which completely negates everything I just said. But whatever, that's part of the experimental process, right? So I'd say there are no hard rules for how we do it.
The only rules are there are no rules. I like it. I like it. Wonderful. Lena, how do you go about using music to set the tone of the narrative?
Oh, goodness. It's, kind of combining thoughts from the previous two panelists. It really is kind of like going in with an assumption at first, and then finding ways to break those assumptions and to really play with expectations. And I always love it, when there is a contrast with, what you're sort of expecting and being surprised by something, because when you do that, you're sort of, if you play to the expectations of someone, of a listener, of a player, or whatever it is, they're not going to notice anything. They're going to just be like, oh, well, this is supposed to be here. This sounds like it should be here. And there's a lot of composers who are telling new composers coming into the field, like that's our job, right? Like our job is to kind of like sit back and provide the expected moments, and if no one notices your work, then you've done a good job because it fit everyone's expectations. And I think that's kind of boring for the most part. So I love to break expectations whenever possible and to surprise people. And it's really fun when you do that in the context of a game, because when you're watching someone play it and you see them react to it in a certain way, then you understand like you've reached them at some point. And so a very simple bit of storytelling without like being an emotional cue was example of like something I did in Celeste, which was one of the first times that I noticed someone like playing a game and then being like, oh, kind of like stepping back and kind of like reevaluating their situation. Is there's the second level you're playing through, and the main character, like you're sort of in this dream sequence, and it's kind of this floaty synthy music, and it's just kind of like, what's going on? There's stuff floating, and then you reach a mirror, and then she sees her reflection in the mirror, and then it breaks through out of the mirror, and then suddenly this like break beat starts playing. And it was just like that one moment of just like deciding, okay, this is the new layer. I'm going to put in a breakbeat here and start just like making it a real jam. And every time I watch someone play through that level and they're like, oh, they kind of like, they realize that something's happening here. It's not just like a normal dream sequence, like something is kind of evolving and changing about it. And so it gets them thinking, it gets them starting to expect new things to change. And so like anytime that there's a moment like that where you can be like, but did you know that this is what was happening? You kind of like, you introduce a new flavor that they're suddenly like tasting, and they're able to, be like, oh, I wonder what the next one is going to be. So that's kind of like, that's my, I don't know, a very simple way of how I approach scoring story and things, is to not always live up to the expectations of someone coming into it, and do something different with it.
I love that. And I love those moments in the game too.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Liam, tell us, I would love to hear more about this musical game, but also just in general, how do you approach using music to set tone of the narrative?
I think like Summerfall's a narrative-driven studio, so we always start with character and narrative. Like, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to get across? And so when we were trying to, obviously in Stray Gods we have score, but the score is quite secondary in some ways to the musical numbers, and they are there to support and tell the story and prelude or reflect these big numbers. And so a lot of it for us was like, what are we trying to do with this individual piece? Like, what is the story we're trying to tell? How do we subvert, as Lena said, like, how do we subvert the expectations of the player, like musically and narratively? Like, all of the characters in Stray Gods are subversions of stereotypes. So, you have the goddess Persephone, who traditionally is, you know, quite powerless in her own and has very little agency in her own story. And so we flipped that on its script, and, you know, in Stray Gods, she killed Hades and stole his throne and then was like outcast for it. And so we wanted to do similar things with the music and genre and, you know, style and expectation. So we started with, you know, well, what is, like, from a musical context, like, what is this song trying to achieve? Like, is it the, you know, the 11 o'clock number? Like, structurally, what is it doing? And then narratively, what is it doing? What the characters care about? And then kind of go from there and set a tone with the music in terms of, you know, is this a comedy sequence? Like what are we trying to get the player to feel at this moment? And then it would go to the lyricists after Austin had sort of messed around for a while and given us like something really interesting. And some of these songs went through like a lot of iterations, and because they're so lengthy, I think like each of them is at minimum 20 minutes of content for like a 4 minutes of like playtime. So there was one song that I think we wrote 3 full 20-minute versions of and scrapped 3 times, and like it was so rough. But just like doing the lyrics for some of those songs was like absolutely fascinating, because you know, poetry and lyricism is like a very different skill set again. And we were very lucky to work with some incredible people who then added so many additional layers of narrative and meaning on top of, you know, the musical backing as well. And then when the performers came in, obviously they also added like a lot of feeling and emotion and story that we couldn't have possibly anticipated. And like that, so for us, it was all like finding out as we went in many ways, but in quite a structured sort of way from the get-go, being like, what is it trying to do? Like, what are we trying to achieve? How do we surprise people and subvert their expectations?
Fantastic. All of these are such good answers. I'm loving this. And I would really love to ask another question kind of to the entire group, which is, how do you each approach player choice in constructing like a strong narrative, but also one that has either a strong soundtrack or strong musical elements? And we've already gotten some great examples, but if you'll have other ones, I would love to hear those as well.
Yeah, I guess when I started writing any music for games, my point of reference, like, for how to go about complementing an existing narrative, like, I only had like movies kind of as a reference point. Like I didn't think to look back and at the annals of video game history and look at how other people had done it. Maybe because it didn't exist yet, because I'm that old or something. I don't know, but like I always thought back to like Howard Shore in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, like having all of these like micro, like every single part of the music was like some reference to something in Tolkien's work. And like I guess, yeah, the more obvious example would be like John Williams with like Star Wars. You know, just like I default to trying to like do like leitmotif and everything. Like I love writing little themes for characters, and any opportunity for me to do that and have it then like mutate and change according to player decisions, that's like the best to me. And I don't know, it works. Like I try when I'm writing that stuff, I try to make those changes as granular and subtle as is possible, like within the constraints of the game. That is to say, like, a character has a theme, but you don't need to like get hit in the head with like an Imperial March every time you get a dark side point. Like, it doesn't have to be that. But also, like, sometimes you have a limited window in which you can communicate those changes, and you kind of have to go for it. It really depends on the game, whether you can like make the case for having a particular moment in a particular place, or whether you can manage to like carve out those moments as the game is literally being written around you, created around you. But yeah, I guess my approach is like start noodling, and eventually I'll get a theme that fits that character, and then I do a lot of like sitting and thinking with a cup of tea on like how I can flip the melody upside down or use a different instrument and like communicate some kind of change that's taken place as a result of what the player has chosen. But I'm definitely making it up as I go along every time I do it.
Aren't we all? But also, like, it is fun to be able to riff off of each other, kind of when we're figuring out what's going on with the story and kind of how characters are going to mutate and change over time. How about you, John?
I was thinking about this question. Like, the way that we design our narratives at Inkle, we're very into lots and lots and lots of micro player choices with a kind of cumulative effect over time. So like one thing we tend to really do all the time is try to let the player like choose every individual line of dialogue that their character says throughout the whole script, and a lot of the time it won't significantly branch the conversation, but you never really know when it will branch the conversation. It kind of, the idea is tiny adjustments that eventually knock the boat off course, right? And occasionally we talk about like, well, you know, can we rig this up to a dynamic music system in some way? Because everybody knows dynamic music systems exist. They must be a solved problem by now. But we've always kind of looked at that and gone, but we don't know what's happening to the player at any given moment. We don't really know what the cumulative effect of these choices they've made so far and are about to make is going to result in when we're halfway through writing this scene, because we're just kind of writing it and seeing where it goes. So we've always steered away from that, because I just know as soon as we tried to do it, the music would ramp up to a massive intensity just before the player chose the "nah, I'm fine, I won't do anything" option, and the music would go boom, and everything would just die. And it would be, you know, it would be funny, but I'm not sure it would be quite worth it, the effort. So I tend to think of it in terms of different time frames, right? The player's moment by moment choices are happening in a kind of short term way. And then in the background is this medium-term thing that the player is driving forward, which they're not really in control of, but they're the only ones in control of. And the music wants to reflect that, I guess. So, you know, we'll score out the music for a particular scene or a particular moment, and then I think the time we did it best probably was in Overboard, just because we had quite a large catalogue of music for us because we did this found music thing. So, you know, every character had a cabin on the ship you could go into, and each of them had a theme associated with them. So one of them was like this bombastic grenadier music, and then another one, there's quite a lot of jazz. There's a little bit of Beethoven and Tchaikovsky, that kind of stuff in it. And then occasionally you'd be in a scene where you've broken into the old woman's compartment and then you were going to suffocate. Oh, it's a game about being a murderer, in case anyone doesn't know that. So you break into this old woman's apartment and you smother her with a pillow, right? Totally normal thing to do. Totally fine. Absolutely okay. My kids were shocked. And then there's one nice thing that you can do there, which is there is usually in those kind of scenes a moment of no return. There's a moment where you do something which you can't take back, and then when you flip the music at that moment, it's terribly effective. It's like you've said, well, this was your medium term situation, but your medium term situation has now changed significantly and you're not getting it back, and the music is a lovely way to convey that. But that we do that in quite a limited way. And I guess I think of it much more as sort of a background element. I guess in the back of my head is this idea that, I don't know, I always worry that players are going to play with it on mute. And you might do all this beautiful work on the soundtrack and then they just don't listen to it. And like, I always think, oh, I've got to balance off against that fear. You can't live your life that way, can you? But like, I never want to go too far into making the music really reflect the game state, because it's just such a hard problem to solve. But it's lovely when we have creative ideas for it. That's really, really nice. And like every time you have a kind of a joke or a moment where you think, oh, this will be perfect. Yeah, that's a really nice toolkit to have. But I quite often wish though that we had an in-house composer, because The one thing we can't ever do is we can't ever say, oh, I know exactly what piece of music I need for this moment right now, because I just don't have it. I can't go and get it. It would be amazing. I kind of, what I really want is like a silent movie where you have the piano guy playing it at the front in real time. I want him like on Zoom or something while you're playing the game, just banging away and following what you're doing. That would be amazing. But yeah, I don't think we can quite, I don't think we can quite swing that one yet.
Not yet, but maybe in a few more games.
Yeah. We'll figure out a way.
All right, how about you, Lena?
Well, it's funny, John, that you mentioned that, because the way that I like to approach dynamism in scoring games is that, like, I really want it to feel like, with a really dynamic score, that the music is accompanying you. You know, essentially, you know, a really good dynamic game score is, it's not scoring the world or the mechanics or anything. It's scoring what you're doing. You know, and so the analogy that I always come back to is that everything that you, the player, do, if the music can react to it in some way, then that's kind of, it's bolstering that illusion that the game knows that you're there and is responding to you in some way, which is why I tend to, for narrative games, it's less about like the minutia of emotional moments, because that's, you know, that's basically, you know, film scoring. You know, you are either like bolstering, you know, an existing scene, or being, you know, an emotional manipulator of some sort to kind of, you know, to change your opinion about something that's happening. And with games, it really kind of has to involve the player in some way. So like a lot of the dynamic stuff that I did in Celeste and in Chicory was very much about framing the play. And so you have a level and you have this sort of dynamic regression that's happening as you're going through the level, and it's changing, but what it's essentially doing is it's wrapping the context of you succeeding, getting past screens, and rewarding you with the music for your victories, essentially, by changing the music, by sort of celebrating the fact that you have gotten that far. And so the music is changing in some way to reflect the narrative progressing. So, you know, in that example earlier, like you resolve the dream sequence, you wander through the world afterwards, and the music, it's reflective of what was happening before, but it's all piano now. It's just kind of like, it's completely changed the context of the score. But I like to, some of my favorite, like, dynamic music scores for emotional content is not really what you would consider like dynamic music, but if you play a lot of visual novels, those are some of my favorite types of games and what they do with music, because mostly the gameplay in visual novels is pushing a button to make the dialogue advance. You know, that is your input, that is your verb, you are advancing the dialogue. But the power of advancing the dialogue and then something happening with the music, or with a sound effect, or with audio or anything, is huge. Like, you know, you're just reading a book basically, but then when you know, hit OK to go on to the next line, suddenly the music drops out. Suddenly, like, you're realizing that some emotional impact is about to happen. That is dynamic. That is like an incredible, like, just, you know, something that affects your gut, you know, when you're playing through something. And so those moments are like great learning devices for figuring out how you can script music and, you know, the gameplay aspect that is still linear. Like you're not, you know, you're not making this like completely dependent on player choice, but the player is still choosing to advance the dialogue. They're still choosing to go, you know, ahead in the gameplay or whatever they're doing. And so having that choice, having that, you know, the button press reflect in that way, I think is like a huge impact for how the game plays out.
Excellent, yeah. And honestly, a great springboard, I think, into Liam. I would love to hear you talking about how you approach choice in constructing narrative, and especially given the context that some of these like visual novel dialogue sequences are like in the context of an actual song that might have different melodies depending on, or counter melodies depending on player choice.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating thing to explore. So like, I think obviously there was the construction of the branching songs themselves, which was like a whole thing. But I think like to me, the role that the score played was really fascinating as like prelude and support, and making sure that we were reflecting player decisions in songs in score. So outside of the big agentic musical moments, making sure that the player's agency was reflected in the medium and then the macro. So for example, like there are multiple times within Stray Gods where like we'll call back to a particular melody that you got as a result of your choices in a given song. So the best example of this is the finale song in Stray Gods, where it basically calls back to every single song in the game that you went through and what was the particular refrain that you chose. And then it will like subvert that refrain somewhat. And on top of that, it also changes the instrumentation depending on, you know, what type of choice you made the most in the game. So if you made like more kick-ass choices or clever choices or charming choices, the instrumentation will change. And that actually happens in several songs throughout the end of the game. Like it will really change depending on your behavior. But my favorite ones are like the narrative choices where it's like, oh, if you chose like Freddy in this particular interaction, then Freddy's melody will actually be a part of the score in the next section. It made the score quite complicated to implement, which ended up falling to me, which was a lot of fun. It's been a long time since I've done any audio engineering, so I was learning a whole new skill set as we went. But I think that the power that music has to highlight and reflect player choice in a narrative agentic context is really incredible. And it's like a conversation that I've had with Austin quite a lot is about how music in games often gets relegated to purely being like that expected support mechanism that just sits there to like make everything else a little bit better. And what we were really determined to do was to say, absolutely not. Like, music is actually the central piece here. So how do we highlight and forefront music in ways that are really interesting while still supporting the narrative and driving that forward in its own context? It was so fascinating. I learned so much doing it. I am very excited to like take all of that into like a more normal game at some point. The game where we're not trying to invent the wheel as we're on the cart. But it was fascinating. It was very cool.
It certainly is really cool, and I love at any time that folks are willing to kind of do something so bold as far as kind of the mixing of music and narrative. So yeah, I would love to definitely ask each one of you a more kind of targeted question and see if that evolves into a little bit of discussion. And then if we have some more time, we can do a couple more general questions. But yeah, let's keep with our order. Devin, so Glitch Hikers, a game that, you know, we worked on, is honestly as much an interactive concept album as it is a video game. But there was one mode in particular, the terminal, that kind of saw us turning an airport into a synthesizer. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that process, including maybe like the fact that at some point I came into the room and was like, hey, we're going to turn an airport into a synthesizer. What do you think of that? And also just more abstractly, how do you invite optional musical elements to become gameplay unto themselves?
So maybe a bit of background on Glitch Hikers then. So like every other game mode in Glitch Hikers, aside from this airport terminal, every other game mode has some limitation placed on your movement. You know, whether you're stuck in a car driving or you're on a train, so you can only move like forward and back between the cars. But from the get-go, you actually, Claris, had a very clear idea that you wanted the terminal to kind of remove all of those restraints. Kind of allow the player this freedom to wander this big empty airport terminal in the middle of the night. And part and parcel with that, we really wanted the simple like act of moving through the space to be enjoyable in and of itself. And I think that kind of explains how we arrived at airport. It's a synthesizer. We wanted we thought it'd be really cool if the music in the space responded in some ways, variety of ways, to like the specific actions of the player, in like a kind of funhouse mirror experiment. And so yeah, the approach was pretty simple. Like I basically made a list of all the different player inputs and then just like figured out what would be the coolest thing to do with that input. So like the most basic player inputs, like walking, would simply add or remove an element of this looping background music, this procedurally generated looping background music that we had. It would change. So like if you started walking, the bass line kicks in. If you stop walking, the bass line stops. But then there were other player movements that we wanted to have something a bit more complex. So for instance, jumping, we wanted it to kind of sound like as you jumped, it was kind of like, we wanted the music to sound like it was kind of opening up when you started jumping and then like clamp back down when you landed. So we had like, basically we'd send that, not to get too technical, but like there'd be like a side chain with a bunch of effects and it would feed it through that. And so, yeah, it would end up sounding like as you jumped, the entire arrangement would just like get soaked in reverb and delay, and there was like a filter that would open up and then it would clamp back down as soon as you landed. So we wanted there to be these like immediate kind of feedback things that could tell you like, I am doing this right now. And it's making the soundtrack do funky stuff. Yeah, so a lot of things like that. My personal favorite being that if you walk on the travelator, it like slightly speeds up the music, so it sounds like you're just very slightly fast forwarding it. But yeah, I guess like more abstractly, one of the biggest challenges with that was like, and this probably applies to a lot of other like music gameplay combos, and feel free to chime in if you have a different perspective, but like for the terminal specifically, it was a big struggle trying to walk the line between giving the player the freedom to express themselves and be creative with this like giant airport synthesizer, while also not having it sound like complete chaos. It's like you want the interactive element to exist somewhere between like the learn by rote of like Guitar Hero and like the unbridled noise wall that is like, I don't know if you've ever played Wii Music, but recording something with Wii Music is just like, yeah. It's like 5 people trying to record at the same time, and it's like weirdly quantized. Anyway, yeah, so it's like not everyone can carry a beat. So how do you let them have an enjoyable experience where they really do feel like they're doing something musical without them being required to like hit a button with impeccable timing? But then also like there are lots of people who can do that, and they want the freedom to do something more exciting than hit the button every downbeat and like have it be good. Yeah, so like our solution was, or at least yeah, my take on what the solution ended up being was, first of all, don't even try and make assumptions about how people are going to use these toys. Like, just don't. Like, don't try and quantize player inputs. Don't like, you know, oh yeah, it'll just kick in 100 milliseconds after they hit the button. No one will have fun with that. And then also like, don't worry about it. Like, make sure that like, I tried to make sure that all of the one-shots that we had and all of the audio effects, I wanted to make sure that everything in general sounded cool, but I didn't want, like, I felt like I was going down the wrong path if I started to get bent out of shape because it wasn't always in time. Like, part of, like, making an airport into a synthesizer, like, it's gonna be messy, especially when everything is, like, soaked in reverb and all these other time-based effects. Like, it's just gonna be super messy. And that's part of the appeal, I guess. I think, does that answer your question? I feel like
It definitely did.
went on a bit of a tangent there, but
All right, I think we'll move on to the next panelist just to make sure that we've got ample time at the end. John, you do a lot of very branching, very narrative projects. How does music support and adapt to what can ultimately be very complex stories that are told in a relatively short amount of time, like in Overboard? How do changes in the music based on your player choices or game states help reinforce the narrative moments?
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of continues on from what I was saying before, doesn't it? It's for me, I like to take quite a collage-based approach to music in general. Like, I don't like to score things too tightly, and I kind of try to make sure that I'm always having fun with it, basically. So, I mean, the way that we write things is that, we write them with a kind of eye to what does a player want to do at any given moment? Can we support them doing what they want to do? Do they have the freedoms that they ought to have? And if they were being this character in this situation, we try to push that to its logical extent as much as we can. And then how do I, as a game designer, make sure that I haven't accidentally let the player just blow everything up and destroy everything and not push the story forward? So we're always balancing those two things. And that's the bulk of the writing job, right? And then when you come to doll it up, when you come to kind of make sure that the effects are there, or the particle effects are there, or the sound effects are there, or the dialogue is nicely polished so that if it just recognizes if you took this particular route, it tweaks itself just to sound a little bit more contextually relevant, or like a bit smarter, like it knows what's going on. And as you're polishing it up, that's often when the scoring pass goes in. And at that point, I mean, I'll do a lot of applying different bits of soundtrack. If we'll have a soundtrack album supplied to us, different bits of soundtrack to see what works, or what resonates, or what makes me laugh, or what offsets what's going on in the scene. And quite often it's quite a random process, and we're not above saying, well, in this case we're going to use one of 3 random tracks because I could not decide which one I thought was better and more appropriate for this scene, so I just put them all in and roll a dice, and that's what plays. And scoring Overboard was just the most fun. Like, the context behind that project was a bit weird in that we basically sat down to see how fast we could make a game, and the whole game was built in 100 days. The basic script was written in a week and then polished up for a couple of months, and the coding happened simultaneously. So the way the music was done was I found a repository of license-free music, and then I would just play the game with this thing running in my earphone, and every time I saw a connection, I would just jam it into the script quite randomly. But it's, and I can't recommend that as a way to score a project, but in any sensible way. But it was a ton of fun. It was exactly as much fun as it sounds like. And if we had a slightly larger budget, I would have been doing that with my Spotify playlist and hiring like the Foo Fighters to give us a track for it in exactly the same way, which is kind of what Kojima did in Death Stranding, right? So it clearly works for other people as well. And that was really enjoyable. So I kind of figure that because we don't have the technical skill. Joe might argue with me. He probably does have the technical skill because we never applied the technical skill to building a fully procedural dynamic system of the kind that Lena and Devin were talking about, which sounds amazing. And because we don't have the composer in house to kind of produce the variation on demand, we kind of figure we might as well push it completely the other way and do something that is just almost gloriously ad hoc and fun. And I think that's worked for us. It's not very scientific, but it has worked for us very well. I think the best the most accurate implementation we've ever done with our music was in Highland, a Highland song where there's 2 soundtracks actually. There's the folk music that we use for the running sections, which are sort of chosen due to various gameplay metrics, which particular track we're going to use when the player triggers one of these jumping sequences. And we play this bit of folk music, and there are gameplay metrics depending on how long the run is going to be. So how long does this chunk of music need to be? And like roughly speaking, what kind of difficulty level are we hoping for? And the weather, like, some tracks work really well when it's raining and other ones don't, that kind of thing. And that selection process is just a system, right? It's just an algorithm, and it tries not to repeat itself and that kind of thing. And then during the rest of the game, we're responding to things like time of day and weather, things which are actually completely outside of the choice structure of the game, really completely, but hopefully just make the vibes work, make the ambience work. So there's a little bit of collaboration with the system rather than directly scripting things. We tend not to say anymore, you walk into this volume, it plays this track inside this volume. It's a little bit more kind of at a remove than that. But a lot of that stems from just the way we build games now at Inkle, because we try to build them quite quickly, and it's faster to make a system make decisions about what to use than it is to actually map everything out by hand, and then you can fix it later. So yeah, that's kind of where we've got to. We have our robot jukeboxes inside. This actually all lives inside the narrative scripting that we script in Ink, which is a scripting language. And so Ink is also doing the logic and controlling the music and doing doing the musical selections for us. So, it's messy, but it's fun. Basically, it's fun to build.
Absolutely, and yeah, just big shout outs to Ink. We use Ink in a lot of our projects as well, and we just appreciate all the work and love that y'all have put into that tool. So Lena, you have worn a lot of hats in the games industry, and I wonder if that has something to do with how you're always able to produce music that seems so deeply in tune with not only the emotional tone and the narrative, but also really tightly integrated into the gameplay. I guess more than anything, I'm curious because you also work with a variety of teams and not necessarily as an in-house person on any one of them. What is your process of working with a team and juggling all those areas of expertise to ensure that the music is speaking to the gameplay and the story and vice versa? Yeah,
I think the real easy simple solution or answer there is that I'm welcomed into the teams as sort of a core member of the team, which is really wonderful when I'm able to do that. With the Celeste team, EXOK, with Wishes Unlimited, Greg's team worked on Chicory and is now working on Beastie Ball. They're all just wonderful people that just sort of, treat me like I'm just a member of the team. And so whether I have feedback on the music or the gameplay or the design that is sort of entwined with these musical systems, they trust my feedback, they trust my ability to have expertise on these things because of the industry background that I've had, which is really definitely a big blessing there that I am able to work with such understanding people, and yeah, just honestly constantly thinking about the situation in which the music is being composed for. I am, it's very difficult for me to write for a game without knowing kind of the general context, and where and why it's playing, and yeah, so even when I was working with Don't Nod on Harmony, which released last year, it was a very sort of tight process of working with the audio director, working with the narrative team to be what are the themes for these characters? What are the tools available to us to to trigger different things based on conditional things in the gameplay, in the narrative choices that you're making. What are the options available to us? And then presenting them with a sort of suite of options of here's this theme, but I could imagine it being played like this without this layer playing, or you could bring in the drums or not have anything except for the violin playing, or whatever it is, just kind of presenting options, knowing what the gameplay limitations are, and just working closely with people that understand what I do and my knowledge.
Wonderful. Awesome. Liam, I would love to ask you one question to kind of round us out here, which is just a little bit more of how you approached wrangling this branching narrative into a musical. How did you kind of explore this, the ability of music to resist or affirm narrative expression? And just yeah, like, how did that process begin of thinking, okay, here's the story we're going to tell, and we know it's going to have all these musical layers. Here's the parts we're going to start stacking up first, and these are the things we're going to start to respond to once we have stuff on the page.
So I think, well before we actually started writing songs, a lot of what we tried to do was like work out structurally, how does an interactive musical differ from a stage musical? Because once the introduction of agency occurs, everything gets fucked up, you know? Like, and that happens in normal narrative as well as, you know, Netflix, when it started to do interactive things, had to relearn how to tell stories, you know? Like, we had the same thing. We were looking at the musical. So we were also looking at it as, in terms of boss battles. So like a musical number in our game is effectively a boss battle, but it can also be a deeply emotional moment, or like a compelling moment of player choice. And there was a lot of tension between all of those things. Like, where was the correct place to have like a big branching musical number? And then once we'd kind of selected the key spots within the narrative, and I don't think we got all of them right, honestly. Like we go back now and we're like, oh, like we really wish that we had have like pulled away from this moment or like pushed into this moment, because now with, you know, the benefit of hindsight, we're like, oh, well, this works best or this doesn't work as well. But I think the hard part with the scope was, you know, how do you achieve what you're trying to do when, you know, very opposite to a procedural system. It's like every single line is bespoke. Every single melody is bespoke. It's just an insane amount of content. And so a lot of it was like, what are we trying to do? How are we trying to achieve it? How can we try to do that efficiently, failing, and then just having to expand the scope exponentially until we made a game that did what we needed it to do, all while being like, we're so sorry to the cinematics team. We're so sorry. So sorry. But also now you have an additional 15 minutes of cinematics to do for this song.
As you say, you were 100% reinventing the wheel as you were building the cart. And also, I can very much commiserate. Just sometimes you absolutely need that scene there to tie it all together. Speaking of tying it all together, I believe we are pretty much at time, so I think we should wrap up. Does anyone have any last things they want to say before we say goodbye?
Just thank you for
having us. Yeah.
Thank you all
Thank
so
you.
much for participating. This is wonderful conversations, and I'm making some notes mentally from all the stuff that y'all are sharing. Thank you again, and take care. Enjoy the rest of your LudoNarraCon.
Thanks, Claris.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.